Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on, well, a really fascinating journey into South Africa.
Hmm.
We're using a pretty diverse set of sources to try and understand the complexities of the country right now.
Yeah, absolutely. The goal is really to get beyond the headlines, wouldn't you say?
Exactly, to get a much richer picture.
And we've got quite the mix, everything from very local community stuff right up to national policy reports, economic analysis.
Even how international media sees things. It's quite a collection.
It really is. Should give us a solid, well-rounded perspective, I think.
Okay, let's dive in then. Our sources give us a look at life on the ground, like what's happening day to day in the Johannesburg suburb of Greenside.
Right, via their Residents Association website.
Yeah, and then we scale up to these big national challenges: healthcare, education.
And those really significant, often interconnected issues around unemployment, land, and the controversies around farm attacks.
Let's start with Greenside. That Residents Association website, it's quite revealing, isn't it?
It really is. It gives you this window into everyday concerns. You see discussions about new building plans,
Development applications, yeah.
changes in zoning for local businesses,
Mm.
can a shop open here, that sort of thing.
And the usual stuff about municipal services, I imagine. Reliability.
Oh, yes. That seems to be a constant theme.
Hmm,
It's a good reminder that these big national issues often play out very locally.
true. And just as an aside, they have the usual website bits, privacy policy, newsletter sign up.
Standard stuff. And interestingly, some unrelated links to betting sites, too.
Huh. Okay. Now, let's contrast that local view with something much broader. The South African Human Rights Commission's report on healthcare access.
Right, a total shift in scale and focus. Here we're talking fundamental constitutional rights.
And what immediately jumps out is that stark division, isn't it, between the private system and the public one?
Absolutely. You've got a well-resourced private system, but it caters to, well, a minority.
And then the public system serving the vast majority but facing huge challenges: underfunding, staff shortages.
Infrastructure issues, yeah. The CHRC report really lays out some serious problems. Lack of ambulances, really long waiting times.
Hygiene and facilities mentioned too.
Yes, that comes up as well. But despite all these difficulties, the report really stresses the constitutional right to emergency medical treatment.
For everyone, right? Public or private hospital.
Exactly. Private hospitals have an obligation, crucially, to stabilize emergency patients, even if they don't have insurance or medical aid.
Before they can consider transferring them to a public facility.
Precisely. Stabilization first.
Okay, now let's layer in some demographics. We have data for Greenside specifically from the 2011 census.
Right, compiled by Adrian Frith. It gives a snapshot of that specific area at that time.
And it shows a majority white population, about 55%, with
Okay.
English as the main language around 69%.
Yeah, followed by Black African at 22%, Indian or Asian at 17%, colored at 3%, and then a small other category. Language-wise, after English, it's Afrikaans, then it's Zulu, and others.
So it's a specific picture, but useful context, especially when we then look at other sources mentioning gentrification in areas like Greenside.
Exactly. Those Reddit discussions, for instance, they talk about Greenside and nearby Parkhurst.
Areas undergoing gentrification.
Right. Attracting younger, wealthier professionals, often noted as predominantly white. You see residential properties flipping to commercial use,
Property values going up.
and the potential displacement of the original, perhaps less wealthy residents. That 2011 data gives us a baseline to think about those shifts.
It really makes you think about these local changes mirroring or maybe driving wider national trends in cities.
Urbanization, economic shifts.
Okay, let's shift gears again to something quite sobering: the broken chalk analysis of the education system.
Yeah, this one paints a really tough picture. The scale of the challenge is just immense.
It starts with basics, doesn't it? Infrastructure. Lack of reliable water, electricity.
Proper sanitation,
Yeah.
even safe classrooms, things you'd assume are fundamental.
And beyond infrastructure.
Deep inequalities in educational outcomes. Huge disparities between schools. Low literacy rates.
That stat about 9-year-olds not being able to read properly is deeply concerning.
It's shocking. And then there's the issue of underqualified teachers in some areas.
The report links this back to apartheid's legacy, I believe.
It does. It underscores how those historical disparities based on race and economic status persist baked into the system almost.
And it creates this cycle.
Exactly. A cycle of illiteracy contributing to high numbers of young people not in employment, education, or training. The NEET rate.
And South Africa's NEET rate is high compared to other countries.
Alarmingly so, yes. Compared to many developed nations, it's a significant issue.
Which leads us very naturally, I suppose, to the Growth Lab's analysis of unemployment.
Right. High unemployment, but also unusually low levels of informal work.
That's the really interesting part, isn't it? You'd sort of expect a massive informal sector where formal jobs are scarce.
You would. It's counterintuitive. Most developing economies have a large informal sector as a buffer.
So why not South Africa, according to this analysis? It's not just a lack of jobs.
Well, they argue it's not just that. They looked at potential push factors, driving people out of work, and pull factors, maybe incentivizing not working.
Like social grants or minimum wages being too high?
They examined that, but found limited evidence that those are the main drivers, especially keeping people out of informal work. The incentives just aren't strong enough compared to potential earnings for many.
So what are the big barriers then?
They point strongly towards spatial factors, geography, the legacy of apartheid spatial planning.
How towns and cities were designed?
Yes. Urban land regulations, low population density in key areas, and critically transport costs.
The cost of getting to potential work.
It's huge. They describe it almost as a tax on working. It eats up such a large chunk of potential low earnings that it makes both formal and, importantly, informal work much less viable for many people.
So it's not just the bus fare itself, but the whole structure of where people live versus where opportunities are.
Precisely. That deliberate separation under apartheid created these long, expensive commutes, especially for Black communities, and that tax on participation persists.
Wow. Okay. Now this brings us to a really sensitive, highly charged topic, farm attacks and the whole white genocide narrative.
Extremely sensitive, yes. We have several news pieces and an Accord report looking into this.
And it's vital we're clear here. The sources, the experts, the fact checkers, they widely refute the claim of genocide, right?
Overwhelmingly, yes. While the killing of farmers of any race is absolutely a serious crime and rightly condemned,
there's no evidence of a coordinated state-sponsored campaign or intent to eliminate white farmers as a group.
Correct. The data and analysis suggest the primary motive is usually robbery, often linked to the broader patterns of high violent crime in the country.
But the narrative itself, the genocide claim, is powerful for some, even if factually wrong.
It is, and it suggests deep-seated fear, insecurity, perhaps anger within certain communities.
What drives that perception, then, do the sources suggest?
Well, connecting it to the land issue seems key. The sources acknowledge the reality. White South Africans still own a vastly disproportionate amount of farmland.
A direct legacy of historical land dispossession.
Right. But using the term genocide is seen by most analysts as a dangerous misrepresentation. It ignores the complex history, the ongoing debates about land inequality, and the very slow progress of land reform.
Let's touch on that land reform history. The PER Journal excerpt gives some context.
It does. Post-apartheid, the goals were clear. Restitution for those who lost land, redistribution to broaden ownership, and securing tenure for vulnerable occupiers.
3 pillars. But progress has been
slow, very slow. By 2014, the piece notes less than 10% of the initial 30% redistribution target had been met.
And challenges making the transferred land productive, too.
Yes, that's another significant hurdle mentioned. Support for new farmers, infrastructure, market access, all complex issues.
This slow pace must fuel frustration.
Understandably, on all sides, really. It feeds into current political tensions.
Like the recent clashes within the unity government over the budget, reported by AP News.
Exactly. Deep disagreements persist between parties like the ANC and DA, especially on things like land reform, but also education, health, foreign policy.
And underpinning all this political debate is the stark reality of over 20 million people relying on social welfare grants.
It just underscores the sheer scale of the unemployment and inequality crisis the government is trying to manage, over 32% unemployment.
And Human Rights Watch reminds us there are other critical human rights issues, too.
Yes, their World Report 2025 highlights ongoing challenges. Xenophobia around elections, for instance.
And violence against women and girls.
Still alarmingly high, despite some legal protections. The new National Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Act was passed, but isn't operational yet.
Children's rights concerns, too.
Basic needs like sanitation, safety, food poverty remain major issues for many children.
And finally, there is that grief mention from a YouTube video title, No black people allowed in South Africa's white-only town.
Yeah, just the title excerpt, so no specifics. But it's a jarring hint that issues of segregation, or at least exclusion, haven't entirely disappeared.
It's another reminder of apartheid's long shadow.
Definitely. These legacies manifest in so many different ways, even today.
So pulling all these threads together, what's the big picture that emerges from this deep dive?
Well, it's definitely a complex web, isn't it?
Yeah.
You see how historical injustices, particularly apartheid, continue to drive socioeconomic inequality today.
Especially around land and wealth distribution.
Right. And that inequality directly impacts access to basic services, healthcare, education, which we saw clearly in the reports.
And it feeds into the huge labor market problems, that high unemployment, the lack of informal work.
It's all interconnected. And the intense debates around things like farm attacks and land reform show just how sensitive the racial dimensions remain, rooted in that history.
Even local issues like development plans in Greenside.
Yeah, they often reflect these bigger national patterns of inequality, urban change, service delivery challenges. It shows how macro issues affect micro-level community life.
So the final thought for you, our listener. Considering these deep-rooted inequalities, these complex challenges we've unpacked, how can South Africa truly address its past and present struggles?
How can we build a genuinely more inclusive, more equitable future? What role could fresh-thinking policy innovation in urban planning, transport, land reform play?
Could that unlock economic opportunities, improve lives for everyone?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? Requires deep thought and, more importantly, concerted action.
Indeed. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.